In creating this pre-flop poker tips video, I tried to think of the tips that would have the most immediate impact on someone's game. In other words, what are the pre-flop things that most people get wrong that I can quickly address and put them on a better path? So let's get to it. Poker should never be played in a vacuum, except in the rare instance where you have absolutely no information. Even after playing just a few hands, you should have some kind of read to go off of. And for a lot of you, you will have long-term HUD stats on your opponents anyway, so there really is no excuse to be lazy on this front. If you are using a static preflop strategy and not making some sort of adjustment, or at least considering an adjustment on every action that you have, you are playing too many tables and need to drop a few and focus more. The games are way too tough today to just play a vanilla strategy and expect to win. If you do nothing else, make sure you at least consider the three opponents directly to your left when you're open raising. In other words, should you steal wider or should you steal tighter? Here's another situation. If somebody is open raised and the action is on you, before you either call or fold, think about how your opponent plays post-flop and see if there is a way to exploit him. For example, does he one and done it with his cbet strategy? Does he play fit or fold on the flop and give up otherwise? Remember, they say poker is a people game played with cards, and there is no truer statement if you want to be a crusher at the table. Before the flop, you should only be flat calling in specific spots for specific reasons. First off, most people call way too much while seated in the blinds, especially the small blind. So instead of just blindly calling with a static range or hands that you think are quote-unquote pretty, you should shift your strategy to a more aggressive approach and look to 3-bet more often with a polarized type range versus the correct opponents. And if 3-betting doesn't appear to be profitable, look to call with high implied odds hands, but only against very tight players. Otherwise, you should tend to 3-bet or fold versus very loose players unless you have a specific post-flop read that you can exploit. Secondly, people call 3-bets way too wide, especially out of position. This is similar to a stealing situation if you really think about it. So basically people are trying to steal your open raise away from you, right? So call with implied odds hands and only against those that are tight 3-betters. Most of the time you should either 4-bet or fold versus people that are wide 3-betters. Unless, once again, you have a specific plan for exploiting them after the flop. Also, this highlights another case where autopiloting can really hurt your win rate, and that's when you have a light 3-better on your left. You should generally be tightening up your opening range and also opening a bit smaller when you have these players to your left. So if you normally raise 3 times the big blind and you have a known aggressive guy seated behind you, you might open to 2.5x or even min raise. Poker is both a game of maximizing your edge while you have the advantage and minimizing your exposure to loss when you don't have the advantage. The entire game of poker revolves around a battle for the blinds or antes. So building an entire strategy with this in mind will make you a much better player. And it all starts with table selection. You should try to sit to the right of tight players and to the left of loose players. One tip that is huge that can help you tremendously if you start doing this today is to label those 4 or 5 people in your player pool, you know who they are, that are rabid blind defenders and are really good at it, and just refuse to sit down when they are seated to the left of you. Nothing kills a win rate more than constantly being put on the defensive by calling stations and super aggressive players seated directly to your left. But once you are in an advantageous table dynamic, you should attack the blinds for as cheaply and as often as you can get away with. In some games, I've been known to steal close to 100% blind versus blind and 60% or more on the button or even the cutoff. You should take as much as they will give you and don't feel bad about it. We are here to win, so hone that killer instinct and be ruthless. And if you want more information on mastering attacking and defending the blinds, I did a video on the subject a while back. I'll put a link above and in the description. This is something that even today I see a lot of people doing because they are following some old charts or some old advice that was maybe relevant 15 years ago or 10 years ago even. And that's that they're opening small pairs and a lot of weak hands that they shouldn't be opening in early position. So what you should do is replace these hands that I'm talking about with hands that just play better post-flop. Start thinking more about post-flop in your pre-flop game and you will be much better off. In fact, you may want to overhaul your entire early and middle position ranges based on this. If you happen to be an online player and have about 100,000 hands or more, take a look at your database and filter for hands that you open in the early positions. Most of you will find out that small pairs and those weaker unsuited broadways and ace X hands are struggling to break even and are most likely long-term losers. Now let's take a look at how we can remedy this by simply rearranging our range a bit. So here I've pulled up a typical early position range that a lot of players use. Now this one is a little bit loose, but you will see people in this 20% range opening still in early position. So what I've done here is just basically just taken what, I see a lot of hands that people are opening and put them here in Poker Stove. So let's take a look at how we might alter this range to make it more profitable in the long term and to make our post-flop decisions just that much easier. So I've pulled up the same range here on the right hand side and we'll just take a look at how the ranges change as we do this. So what I will first do is take out the small pairs. Early position sixes can even be marginal, but I would still leave sixes in there. I would take off the weak unsuited broadways and at the same time add in some more suited hands. I would add in even the small ace X hands like these hands that can make the wheel that are suited. This will give you some more semi-bluff opportunities. I would much rather have ace 5 suited, than I would ace 10 or ace 9 offsuit. Even when you make top pairs with these hands from early position, you just can't be sure. It's not like you can just fire 3 barrels every time, right? So whether you make top pair with an ace 5 or an ace 10, you're going to be playing it as a marginal showdown value type hand anyway a lot of the time. So it's the times that you miss your hand that you really need to have something else going for you some percentage of the time. And that's where having suited hands becomes much more useful. So what I'll also do is add in some more suited connectors and some of these suited hands like King 9, Queen 9, Jack 9, etc. And we'll rebuild our range. Now you can also add in some hands like this, like semi-connectors. I wouldn't go too far with this, but adding these hands in will make you a lot more difficult to read when you open. So this will balance out some of the stronger hands in your range. So when some of those middle boards come, people can't just assume that you have overcards or haven't connected to that board in some way. It'll make you a lot more balanced is what I'm saying. And also having these hands will also, as I said, create more semi-bluff opportunities for you. Now we have a kind of a leaner, meaner range now, like 17.6. But in today's game, in early position, I would actually recommend going ahead and tightening up just slightly in at least early position. Now middle position, you can go ahead and loosen up a little bit more, maybe add some 5s in, maybe add these hands back in here, but still keep this pretty much this profile of your hand range and you'll be much better off. I know this won't apply to everybody watching this video because some of you will be live players or some of you will play on sites that just don't have HUDs or they have a limited HUD. However, this information can still help you in thinking about what type of reads you should be using at the table to make your decisions. You should make sure that every stat in your HUD or everything that you think about as far as your reads on your opponent should be actionable information. In other words, every single HUD stat or every single read you have should have a specific purpose when you are playing at the tables. A lot of people have these cluttered HUDs with dozens of stats, many of which are hardly used at all. And some of the ones they do have are misused because they normalize so slowly, the stats will just be completely off just because there's not a big enough hand sample. Let me illustrate what I'm talking about here by building a quick HUD for you using Hold'em Manager so that you can see exactly what I'm talking about. So here we are in the HUD designer of Hold'em Manager 2. Now, if you don't know anything about creating HUDs or using a HUD in online poker, I'll put a link above and a link in the description below that will give you all the information you need to get a HUD set up on the site you play, if possible. So the first thing you want to know is how many pots do your opponents play overall. So the stat I use for that is VPIP. We'll add that in. We'll put it above the fold right here. So basically what that says is just what percentage of hands a person plays before the flop. Very simple. Most of you already know this stuff, right? And the main reason for using VPIP is not really for most of your opponents. It's so you can spot a fish more easily. That's the only real reason I use VPIP, honestly. Every other read that I gain on a player has nothing to do with VPIP for the most part. So I want to be able to spot a fish fast. So if I see a guy sitting here with 77 VPIP, you know, his other stats may not tell me that he's a fish, but I need this one just so I can keep that in mind, right? The second thing you need to know is how often an opponent folds to steals. So to find that, you just need to see what a person does versus steals. And here it is, total fold to steal. So when I'm about to steal, I'll see if that guy has a high percentage, and I'll be able to tailor my opening range based on how often he folds to a steal. If he folds to a steal really often, I'll steal wider. If he defends often and folds to steals less, I will open less. All of my frequencies for open ranges will be dependent on what the players are doing behind me. This is actionable information that I can use on my HUD, and I can use it often. I'm always going to be opening hands, right? A lot of the time. This is going to happen very often, so you're going to be in a steal spot, who knows what percent, a large percentage of the time you're playing poker. So you need this stat up top, and you need to know what the opponents are doing behind you, so there we go. The next thing you might want to know is how often somebody re-steals. So that's probably here in the same thing and here it is, total re-steal, 3-bet versus steal. So if they do defend wide, if this is low here, I want to know how often they're calling and how often they're 3-betting. So if they're 3-betting if they're folding to steal 70% and they're 3-betting 30%, I know that they're either 3-betting or folding. If they're folding to steal 50% and they're stealing 10%, I know that they're calling 40% of the time, right? So I can use this information to make my decisions. I might want to open a little bit tighter if somebody 3-bets wide, whereas if they're just calling and playing out of position versus me, I may not want to tighten up at all. I just want to make them play out of position and gain my advantage that way. The next thing I really want to know is how often somebody steals. So there should be a steal line on here somewhere, and here it is, raise first in or steal. So here we go, total steal. And I'll move that down. We'll go to the second line for that. So when you're deciding whether to 3-bet or not, or whether to call, knowing how often somebody's stealing versus you really is helpful in a battle for the blinds, right? Now you can get more elaborate than this, and you can put their raise first in from all positions on here, and I do that on my own HUD, but if you want to just keep it simple for now, just knowing how often somebody steals is going to help you tremendously. And the way to use this, really, I recommend is if somebody's on the button, consider that their steal is going to be higher than what their stat is showing. So if somebody is stealing 35% overall, they're probably stealing like 45% on the button, probably like 25% in the cutoff, and probably like the 35 to 40% in the small blind. So they're usually loosest on the button, tightest in the cutoff, and somewhere in between in the small blind. Now this can vary, but this is a pretty good rule of thumb that I found in studying databases. This is typically what people do. So you don't need to have these elaborate stats. And the good thing is if you just have a one steal stat, it's going to normalize a lot faster. So if you have only 30, 40 hands on a player or less, you can still get a good idea of how often he steals. Whereas if you have a stat for every single position, you're going to have to wait a couple of hundred hands before you know exactly what he's doing. I want to be able to react to the players I'm not playing with very often and not just only be playing against the regs, right? The next thing I want to know is when we do get to the flop, how aggressive is my opponent? So I need to look at his aggression factor. So we'll go down here to some of the post-flop stats, and it should be aggression, right? So post-flop aggression percentage right here in front. So basically what this says is how often they're betting or raising versus calling or checking, right? So generally a passive player will be 30% aggression percentage or less. And a normal person, the typical range is somewhere between 30 and 40, and over 40%, even over 38%, you're starting to get to the really aggressive side. My typical aggression frequency personally is somewhere around 45 to 48%, but you'll see people with 50, 55%. But your typical aggressive player will be in that, your aggressive reg will be somewhere between 35 and 40. And this stat will tend to normalize a lot quicker than some of the other stats you'll see. So if somebody's aggressively betting after the flop and they have a low aggression percentage, that's actionable information to me because I know they have a tighter range because they're less aggressive. So I can consider when somebody tight is betting or raising me, I probably should just give them credit for a strong hand. Whereas if it looks like a dynamic board and it's a good semi-bluff spot, or if it's a spot where an opponent might be bluffing against me, or if my range is weak in this spot, I know he might be trying to capitalize on that. If I see an aggression factor of something like 45 to 50%, then I might continue in that hand with a marginal made hand just because he might be so imbalanced towards bluffs, right? So that once again, actionable information on both ends of the spectrum that can help you tremendously. The next stat I like to have, and this does take a little bit longer to normalize, but I still keep it in my HUD always, is how often somebody folds to a cbet. So that's under the versus continuation bet right here. So, you can get more elaborate with this and do out of position and in position, but just getting a general idea through their fold to cbet on the flop will tell you a lot of stuff. So you're going to have some hands on a player, like 100 hands at least probably, to ever have any kind of fold to cbet. But once you do have those stats, it can become invaluable on building a post-flop range for your opponent. If he folds to cbet super often, you know he's a fit or fold player. If he's only folding to cbets like 30%, well, you know he's floating a lot. He's looking to make moves on later streets, and you can take more marginal hands to later streets, whereas against people that are only fit or fold, and if they're betting or raising, you probably just need to give them credit, right? So once again, we have actionable information that we can use right now. And the other information I would put on here is how often they cbet. So flop cbet percentage, I mean, you can move this down another line if you want because we can't really see it here. But so here we go. We got how often they fold to a cbet, and now how often they cbet. Now aggression percentage will tell you a lot of this, so that normalizes faster. But once you do have a cbet percentage, you can once again get a pretty good idea of what their range is going to look like after the flop. If somebody's cbet's only 40%, you know they're probably fit or fold. If they're cbetting 80 or 90%, you know they're just firing it pretty much at almost every flop. So you can play back at those players, you can float those players. Once again, actionable information, right? And that's the whole name of the game here. So if you weren't going to do anything else and you want the most basic HUD possible, you really can't go wrong with this one right here. You know how wide they are pre-flop, how many hands they play, you know how often they fold to a steal, you know how often they steal, you know how often they're 3-betting or re-stealing, you know how aggressive they are post-flop, you know how they react to your bets post-flop, and you know how they're betting post-flop. I mean, what more information do you need? Just using these stats alone will probably get you 90% of the way there and normalize a lot faster than trying to have one of these huge complicated HUDs with like 20 stats on it. It drives me crazy when I'm watching a poker video online and some guy's got like stats for everything. I'm like, this guy's only playing against the regs because the only players that are going to normalize 80% of his HUD he's going to have like 10,000 hands on him. And it's good to know what those players are doing, but that's not the players I want to target when I'm playing. I want to target the bad players and kind of just equalize versus the regs, right? So having a more leaner HUD like this will move your focus from trying to be reg-based battles, battling with regs, and more let me exploit players, let me find weaknesses, the obvious weaknesses, and let me just think about ranges. What's the board texture? What's the action? What's the recent history? All the things that are going to make the most difference to my bottom line right now. And also HUDs can just make you become a play machine, if you know what that is, meaning that you're just trying to push every little small edge here or there, and you're kind of not seeing the forest for the trees if you do that. You need to get through those trees and get to the lake and find the fish, right? That's kind of what this is all about. So I hope these tips will help you do a quick reality check on your pre-flop game as you move toward plugging those leaks and becoming a more profitable player. And if you can think of any other helpful tips, please post them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching.